Cameras and photography have long been tools to subvert propaganda and cast a critical eye back on the government. I'd like to focus on the human aspect of cameras, from forever changing the public's view on war to saving hundreds of Jewish lives from Nazi concentration camps back in World War II. This all starts in the Civil War with photographers like Matthew Brady, who used his photography skills and teams of professional photographers to document the war and send it back to the public. The most important thing that they did was something called carte de visite, which are negatives of films that allowed them to make multiples of political figures and generals to create a stately atmosphere, as well as take individual photos of soldiers, allowing families for the first time to have a physical representation of their loved one back at home. This continued on into World War I, where professional photographers were on the front lines, but the government did not want them taking photos that would cast them in a bad light. But Contax had come out with a new type of camera called the pocket camera that allowed soldiers to carry with them a camera and take photos of what was really going on during the war, which they sent back home. By World War II, this had been a well-known phenomenon, and another company had entered the game. No longer was it Contax, but it was Leica. And Leica was owned by the Germans, and the Nazis really liked their cameras and forced them to have slave labor. But Ernst and Elias Leitz, the owners of Leica, had Jewish family members and Jewish employees and did not want to go along with the Nazi plan. And they created something called the Leica Freedom Train, where they gave out press passes and camera ambassadorships to Jewish families and shuttled about 700 to 800 Ukrainian Jewish slaves from the concentration camps. This was a huge impact and is partly the reason why many camera shops today are still owned by Jewish families. Vietnam, governments hadn't truly learned their lesson about letting soldiers take photos, and they'd sent professional photographers, and the media was more critical than ever of war in general, and were willing to disseminate these photos. Many of the photos that they disseminated, like the Saigon execution, a photo taken on, again, another Leica camera, showing a chief of police in Saigon for the Southern Vietnamese, the side we were supporting, executing a civilian. And then Nick UT, a photographer, took a photo of the Trong Bang Road, which is called the photo that ended the war, because they did not expect the firebombing to affect children. And he took a photo of these children fleeing the firebombing in the early 70s, and that sparked massive outrage and massive protests in America that helped end the war. In the Gulf War, much happened again, but the media was very much on the sides of the government and would not disseminate these photos, including a very famous photo that was released months after the Gulf War had ended, called The Death of an Iraqi Soldier, that depicted a burned out corpse. Instead, the media only disseminated photos of young American soldiers marching off to war, and not the photos of soldiers learning of their friends dying. They did this specifically to avoid protests occurring and keep popular support for the war. And so, though photography can be used and manipulated as a tool of propaganda, this was actually an issue in the Civil War. When Photoshop didn't exist, Matthew Brady would have other photographers drag bodies into his photos to make them look much worse than it really had occurred at that scene. Not to say that the scene was not a brutal scene to begin with, but they're also an incredibly powerful tool of protest and liberation, as seen in the early 30s in Germany, the Lights Camera Company, or in Vietnam, is photographers took photos that changed the world and ended wars. Um, there's so much, in fact, that governments now highly control what photos are released to prevent public backlash and protest. The U.S. military no longer allows embedded reporters, for the most part, and relies on their own combat camera units to take photos for publication.